Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I should also say good afternoon and good evening to those of you who are joining us from other parts of the world. We know that we're all joining each other from different time zones today. We're very excited to welcome you all to the 9th out of the 10 events in our Climate Change Solutions Frontline Perspectives from Around the Globe webinar series. My name is Erin Gill, and I'm a graduate research assistant with the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, and I'll be your host for today. The Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, along with our partners at World Resources Institute and Environmental Defense Fund, are honored to host today's presentation by Mr. John Leitner. Mr. Leitner joins us today from his office at the international law firm of Baker Botts in New York City. But he's going to speak with us about South Korea's perspectives on climate change and their intersection with the country's economic development strategies. Before we begin, please note a few housekeeping notes. We are going to leave time for a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. However, because of the large number of people participating, we ask that you please submit your questions in writing using the chat feature on the right-hand side of the WebEx screen. We'll also communicate with you through that feature throughout the presentation. You can send in your questions to the host at any time, and we will compile them and select as many as we can to convey to Mr. Leitner at the end. Note that when you send a question, feel free to include your name, affiliation, and where you're joining us from, and we can provide that information to the group when we read your question. We are recording this presentation, and so if you have to leave at any time or miss a portion or just want to access this information later, the recording of this will be available later this week on the YCELP as well as the WebEx website. So without much further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. John Leitner. John is a fellow of the Seoul National University Center for Energy and Environmental Law and Policy and was formerly a faculty member at the Seoul National University School of Law. As one of the founding members of the Center for Environmental and Energy Law and Policy, he has been involved in many aspects of the center's work, including independent research, consulting, and advisory work for various agencies of the Korean government in international environmental collaborations throughout Asia. He has lectured extensively on Korean environmental law at universities and institutions throughout Korea, as well as in many Asian nations, the U.S. and Europe. Mr. Leitner's research relates to environmental regulation, administrative law, and privacy. As I mentioned, he joins us today from New York, where he currently practices law at the international law firm of Baker Botts. There he counsels clients in corporate law and government matters and advises on issues of regulatory compliance. John, welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our audience, and thank you for lending your valuable insight, experience, and expertise to our series. With that, I'm going to now hand it over to you.
Well, Erin, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone who's joining the session today. I very much appreciate the invitation from YCELP to speak and have this session with all of you today. As Erin mentioned, I'm a fellow at the Seoul National University Center for Environmental and Energy Law and Policy, and until last month, it was my privilege to have been a faculty member at Seoul National University Law School for about 2.5 years. The Environmental Law and Policy Center at Seoul National University is about 2 years old. It was founded by one of my colleagues at Seoul National University, Professor Hong-Shik Cho, and it's been a great pleasure for me to collaborate with him on a forthcoming paper about Korean environmental law, and specifically Korean green growth policy. So that will be the focus of my talk today. And I'd just like to mention that, of course, I would personally always be very happy to speak with any of you about these topics, but I also could not commend enough contacting or reaching out to my colleagues at the Seoul National University Center for Environmental and Energy Law and Policy. The faculty members there are truly some of the leading experts, not just about Korean environmental law, but issues throughout Asia and indeed on a global level as well. And so I hope that many of you will have the opportunity going forward to be in touch with them and perhaps work together with them and with us on a variety of areas of shared interest. I do have to also note, as a preliminary matter, I'm sorry I'm a bit under the weather at the moment, so perhaps it's better that we're in webinar rather than seminar so that you're all well insulated from catching whatever I have. About a week and a half ago in New York, it was an extremely hot and humid weekend, and so everyone was saying global warming, and then just a few days later it became cold, rainy, perhaps the temperature went down about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and so perhaps the response of many people would be global weirding. But whether we use the language of warming or weirding, either way, it brings us to the central topic of this webinar series, which is climate change and the various law and policy responses that major carbon-emitting nations have been pursuing to date when it comes to their domestic law, when it comes to their engagement on the international stage in trying to deal with these issues. So I'll be focusing on Korea today, and principally examining this issue as one of a set of environmental dilemmas and economic policy challenges that the Korean government and Korean society generally has in recent years tried to address through a seemingly comprehensive statutory and regulatory scheme generally entitled green growth. As a matter of just a little bit of an overview, I'll give you a bit of background information about South Korea in terms of its policies in previous years and decades, and also how it fits into the picture of being a major carbon-emitting nation. I'll provide some specific context about the Korean green growth law, and then focus specifically on a number of seeming applications of that law in particular projects and specific endeavors by the Korean government to try to implement this so-called green growth vision into a realized and established policy form. And then I'll try to give some international applications so we can see how, if at all, this green growth phenomenon in Korea is directly or indirectly relevant to people and to the international law system generally throughout the world. So we might first ask ourselves, what is meant by this phrase, green growth? In the abstract, the objectives of Korean green growth are very similar to the familiar key pillars of sustainable development. In the abstract, the idea that economic development should continue while simultaneously environmental integrity should be promoted and maintained, and also that social development should be facilitated. So how could we be a little more concrete about these goals? Well, one of them should be some sort of measurable improvement in economic performance, although the metrics may be debatable. In the Korean green growth experience so far, some key metrics have been general growth of the economy, such as kind of bottom line GDP growth, but also a very important issue, employment rate, and median income as well. And then to try to be a little more specific about the idea of environmental integrity, perhaps in particular focusing on the preservation of ecosystems and biodiversity, and also trying to pursue climate change mitigation and also adaptation. And perhaps the most elusive of these major goals or pillars, both in sustainable development experience and also in green growth experience, is in what specific way social development can or should or perhaps must be advanced as part of this broader green growth strategy. And so it's really through the prism of green growth that Korea has tried to address and advance specific policies about climate change up until now. So climate change then occupies sort of a piece of this broader puzzle of Korean green growth. I don't want to spend too much time on some of the background information, but it should be a surprise to none of us that the set of environmental challenges that nations like Korea are seeking to address are quite diverse and quite daunting. Climate change is certainly a big one. Korea has struggled with pollution and contamination issues and how to try to address this in such a way as to improve human health, maintain biodiversity, and try to also maintain diversity of ecosystems. The risks in the area of climate change are certainly indefinite, but potentially very substantial for countries around the world, and Korea is one of them. Certainly Korea's geography and somewhat tenuous position when it comes to the ability to provide food supply or to utilize its resources under the current climate or existing climate conditions raises the risk that shifts and changes in climate patterns could have a particularly harmful effect for a nation like Korea. And so as Korea addresses climate change as part of its green growth policy, the dual goals of mitigation and adaptation are both extremely important. Korea is a fairly major carbon-emitting nation, but its position in terms of how much carbon it emits is exceeded by its carbon intensity. Korea is a very carbon-intense economy, and so for Korea, it's been a very big challenge to see how to potentially facilitate economic growth, continuous economic growth, which up until now in Korea has been driven in many ways by manufacturing and industry and other carbon-intense economic sectors, while at the same time trying to reduce carbon intensity and manage carbon emissions overall. Certainly we know that carbon emissions is sort of a classic global problem, that the contributions to carbon concentration in the atmosphere from around the world are all collectively what will determine the level of carbon in the atmosphere and the amount of carbon that can then be relevant to changing climate patterns throughout the world. And so in that sense then mitigating carbon emissions is a global public good, one that we might expect in the absence of firm international commitments to be chronically undersupplied. So Korea, as a carbon-intense, energy import-dependent nation, finds itself now in the position, is it possible for Korea to establish itself as an international leader through domestic policies, through participation in international forums, to try to make a meaningful contribution to this global picture of managing, mitigating carbon emissions and hopefully the deleterious consequences of climate change over time. So when it comes to the sequence of international environmental efforts in the area of climate change so far, one thing we might note is so starting 20 years ago with the original Rio summit, we have the initial convention on climate change issues and then the annual conference of party meetings. Korea, in the early years, in the 90s of the Conference of Parties sequence, took arguably more passive role. For instance, in the Kyoto meeting, which gave rise to the Kyoto Protocol, Korea maintained that it should not be considered an Annex I nation. It should not undertake any sort of firm commitment when it came to the level of future carbon emissions. On the basic idea that Korea was still a developing nation, that it simply couldn't afford to undertake the kind of binding commitments that a wealthier country or group of countries, the United States, Japan, or the EU, could afford to assume. Since then, however, Korea has been more assertive and tried to take more of a leadership role when it comes to international environmental law. Notably, for the Conference of Parties this year, Korea tried very hard to host that particular conference, and in fact was one of the two finalist nations. In the end, it went to Qatar, but South Korea was the other finalist nation, and in fact had great enthusiasm when it came to trying to take the lead and take the role of hosting this critical Conference of Parties this year. Another big event this year is the Rio +20 conference, marking 20 years since the original Rio summit and convention on climate change. And in that area as well, Korea has tried to be much more assertive and to try to take a more active role in providing some kind of international leadership and some kind of international innovation when it comes to contributing to the contents of what may eventually become a new agreement and new regime to succeed not just the original climate change convention, but more broadly a post-Kyoto Protocol regime as well. So as I noted, Korea is not an Annex I nation under the Climate Change Convention and Kyoto Protocol system, However, its continued economic development since the 90s means that Korea's per capita GDP now exceeds several of the Annex I nations. And so the critical question for Korea has been how to assume more international responsibility through its domestic law, through its international participation. And the key answer to that question so far has been green growth. Green growth has been perhaps one of the central policy initiatives of the current Korean president, President Myung-Bak Lee, who took office nearly 5 years ago. He immediately proposed a green growth plan. It entered into law at the beginning of 2010 as the Green Growth Low Carbon Fundamental Act. Korea is fundamentally a civil law system based upon a series of fundamental civil codes. And this new legislation, at least on its face, purports to be an additional fundamental law, an additional piece of this foundation of seemingly the most basic and authoritative sources of law for Korea's civil system. So I'd like to start out by describing some of the broader theories and at least the articulated justifications for the Green Growth Law in Korea. So the perhaps defining the central position of the Korean government about green growth legislation is that it could define a new path for Korea, not just in terms of environmental protection, but also in terms of future economic development. While it's a little bit ambiguous exactly how this further economic development would be measured or how its success could be measured, the idea might generally be framed as Korea's economy is one which, based upon its carbon emissions, based upon the comparative advantage that Korea has experienced, but dwindling comparative advantage as labor costs rise, as input costs rise, that Korea's economy is in need of major transformation. And so it's not just a matter of environmental responsibility and global accountability, but also domestic self-interest to define a new vision that can harmonize economic growth with environmental protection. So in very general terms, the idea is framing economic development as going from a sort of brown economy, a manufacturing-driven, carbon-intense, pollution-heavy economy, to, in some form, a green economy. The idea that greenhouse gas emissions can be limited and certainly as compared to business as usual rates reduced in the future. And to consider these policies as revolving around the idea that the environment is a valued asset. In this way, perhaps we see a certain tension when it comes to the basis and justification for assuming environmentally responsible policies. Perhaps we might contrast to something like a deep ecology view. Is the environment to be protected because it's a public good in and of itself, because it has some kind of intrinsic value, perhaps even immeasurable or undefinable value, which is central to the reason why we protect it? Or do we protect the environment because it is a precious and not exactly renewable resource, one which is an asset which can be valued and can be defended in the context of a broader economic strategy, one which seeks to ultimately quantify the basis for specific green growth policies that might be assumed. So this is perhaps, in the abstract, the way that this sort of relationship is envisioned, that there's not a trade-off to be made between economic growth and environmental protection, but an actual synergy, either a synergy which can be generally applicable to societies around the world, or at least something like a first-mover synergy if Korea acts more decisively with more unified central legislation and with a more unified vision emanating from its central government that can mobilize and motivate different sectors of Korean economy and Korean society to act in an organized, concerted direction to try to pursue green growth objectives. That Korea, at least, and other more aggressive, ambitious nations can achieve a synergy between economy and environment. I think one thing which may be useful in order to put this green growth idea in context for us is to quickly contrast Korea's stated vision of green growth to the pre-existing concept of sustainable development. There may be no one single definition of sustainable development which is universally agreed upon, but on a general level, agreement has coalesced around the idea that sustainable development is defined in terms of three central pillars: environment, economy, and equity or justice, sometimes called the 3 E's. It's been argued that Korean green growth is different in as much as it seemingly shifts from 3 pillars to 2, explicitly focusing on environment and economy, but not necessarily building the equity or justice concept directly into its policy making. However, one argument in favor may be that, frankly, to try to require that any particular law or policy fully answer and satisfy any equity or justice-based objection is, in fact, to handicap the lawmaking process with an impossible burden that every political debate in an information and procedurally open society is driven by competing views about what would be most just or equitable in terms of an outcome, and that universal agreement would never be possible. Isn't it better, the argument goes, to focus on those policies which we can more concretely advance, which we can have a stronger and more agreed upon evidentiary basis for saying we are promoting environmental protection, economic development, and to rely upon the basically procedurally fair political process which gives rise to those 2 sets of policy goals as furnishing the basis for saying that these policies are equitable, just, or democratically legitimate. On the other hand, it may be difficult to say that the process itself is any assurance that either in this moment or through time, the equity or justice element of the lawmaking process is being satisfied, or that the necessary durability of any particular law or policy as garnering support and being understood as being legitimate through time will be maintained. That might be a very general observation, which I'll try to give much more specific content to with a concrete example from Korean law a little later in the presentation. So to try to be a little more specific, the green growth law was accompanied by 2 major stated objectives from the Korean president. The first would be the objective of reducing Korean greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020 to 30% below the business as usual level. And then the other stated objective was to devote 2% of the annual GDP of Korea to so-called green growth investment and development projects, as generally defined by the green growth legislation. To dig into that legislation, this green growth law in a little more detail, the stated purposes of the law include improving Korea's status in the international community. And while it might at first seem a little bit surprising to see that kind of goal stated explicitly in particular legislation, perhaps in a way it's simply acknowledging what might be obvious to many parties overall. I recall one occasion shortly after I joined the faculty of Seoul National University, some of my colleagues and I were speaking with some of the faculty members from the Belfer Center at Harvard, and on the issue of cap-and-trade law, in particular, Korea's interest in unilaterally implementing a domestic cap-and-trade system to try to take a concrete step towards achieving the mitigation of carbon emissions. One big question was, if Korea is acting more or less unilaterally, certain other cap-and-trade systems, such as the EU system, already exist, but the future of cap-and-trade is indefinite. Many of the world's leading economies and the vast majority of nations are not subject to any overall cap-and-trade system for their major carbon emitters. So what benefit to Korea of acting first? And so we went through some of the possibilities, but the main theme that was coming up, and the main one that the colleagues from the Belfer Center could offer was, well, wouldn't this be a really nice way for Korea to assert itself on the international stage as an environmentally responsible actor, as a country that's willing to take a leadership position rather than just a follower position when it comes to the issue of climate change, and perhaps to signal that Korea is, in general, a more major player and a more influential nation on the world stage for law and policy issues generally. However, that must not be the only objective of green growth. Another one would be to see the promotion of international cooperation and, quote, expansion in overseas markets. That's a quotation from the official English translation of the statute, which of course was originally in the Korean language. And so some of the specific possibilities may be, well, as I mentioned before, achieving a kind of first mover advantage when it comes to green economy or green industry issues. Another possibility may be utilizing the green growth framework, linking with other nations and seeking, for instance, trans-border opportunities to find lower cost carbon mitigation opportunities. Korea in recent years has been very interested, for instance, in forestry preservation projects in Indonesia, seeking within the Asian and Southeast Asian community generally those lowest cost carbon emission mitigation opportunities. And one thing we should note is that as compared to many other nations, certainly as compared to the United States, the Korean president enjoys a more consolidated and unitary power. And the green growth law and structure reflects that, as power effectively emanates from the president, who has vast administrative power and responsibilities through his executive branch to define the specific nature of green growth projects and to try to translate the broader principles of the Green Growth Statute into specific policies going forward. The law itself has a strongly economic emphasis in several areas, so it defines green technology, green finance, green investment companies, proposes various possible tax reforms related to trying to stimulate or incentivize environmentally responsible or carbon emission mitigating policies by private or semi-private actors. In general, one of the merits of green growth is said to be that it embraces an incentive instruments approach to achieving environmental benefits. That it defines a set of stimuli which parties can then act in a self-interested way in the direction of reducing carbon emissions, of being more protective environmentally. In other words, that it defines the decision-making environment in such a way as to lead private actors and all the other participants in the key economic decisions in Korea to individually and collectively act in ways that achieves a more harmonious balance between economic development and environmental law. The extent to which green growth so far actually has embodied this idea of incentive-based system rather than, for instance, command and control by the central government is perhaps one of the central debates and controversies about whether green growth in practice has reflected green growth in theory. And something that I'll touch on at the end, and something that might be of great interest to participants from outside of Korea, what is the current situation with cap and trade? The Green Growth Law famously empowered seemingly empowered the administrative branch to begin pursuing carbon mitigation management policies through its regulatory power over Korean industry. But also generally specified that the Korean legislature may create a system in the future for trading greenhouse gas emissions using market functions, clearly suggesting, in general language, a cap-and-trade system. This is something that has taken more concrete form in Korean legislative proposals and currently is a very hot issue being debated in Korea. I'd like to jump ahead just a little bit. So as we move from thinking about Korean green growth in theory to the specific experience of green growth in practice in Korea so far, we might want to note what is the international interest or relevance of what Korea is doing domestically. So one possibility is that Korean green growth defines various general or specific domestic law alternatives that other countries may, in their own domestic law, consider adapting or otherwise implementing in similar or identical form. This might be generally called the phenomenon of legal transplantation. Throughout the history of law in societies around the world, East and West alike, there's a notable history of transplantation of either particular legal concepts, portions of legal sources, or even entire legal systems from one society to another. In recent years, the basis for this has been less often imposition and more often a seemingly more efficient opportunity for societies to learn from each other, to exchange, and potentially to adopt innovations that come from other legal systems for the greater efficacy of one's own legal system. So one thing I'll just note briefly is that for most of its history, certainly for its colonial and World War II era history, Korea was the very definition of a society which receives transplantations from abroad. In the case of Korea's history as a Japanese colony before and during World War II, this was transplantation by force. And in Korea's post-liberation democracy, or I shouldn't say democracy, post-World War II liberation period, again, systematic adoption of legal sources from abroad. It's quite notable to think that at this moment, as Korea has now for more than 20 years existed as a procedurally fair democracy, as Korea does seem to assert itself more and more on an international stage, is it possible that Korea for the first time could go from a recipient nation to actually being a source nation of law or particular policy innovation. The other possibility for how green growth could be relevant is whether some of its aspects could be generalized and implemented as part of an international system, whether, for instance, through the Conference of Parties negotiations, potentially having a role to play in whatever the product document may be from the conference this summer, the Rio +20 Sustainability Conference. So these could potentially be sort of conduits through which green growth may exert an influence, whether in domestic law of other nations or in the international public law system generally. In thinking about how desirable those changes may be, we would really want to ask ourselves, what has been the Korean green growth experience in practice in these last several years? Simultaneous to its green growth proposals, Korea has been, on the level of the national government, very supportive of the idea of ubiquitous cities. I would like to offer this concept as a way in which Korean law has at least arguably been sort of lawmaking more government at its best from the standpoint of a seemingly very concrete and potentially meaningful achievement in the area of green growth theory being turned into practice. I'll then contrast that with a more famous and specific project called the Four Rivers Project, a major public investment in the modification of four of the most conspicuous and important rivers in Korea. And then I'll end with a brief note about what's going on in Korea regarding a cap-and-trade system. The idea of a ubiquitous city is that it's an urban environment in which network technology is ubiquitous, is seamlessly infused in every dimension of life, and seamlessly interconnected with the various different levels in which the network operates. So the idea would be something like a city where your home, your residence, your apartment building has a kind of information or sensory information constantly gathered and processed and intelligently analyzed. Something like, for instance, a certain amount of pressure on the floor might indicate that an elderly person has fallen and may need medical help. going out into public, throwing a plastic container into a recycling bin, may utilize a radio frequency to record which person has recycled their bottle and to give them some kind of credit, or perhaps if they don't recycle, give them some kind of demerit, maybe a financial regulatory incentive or disincentive when it comes to recycling, and to facilitate aspects of human life generally by enabling information, raw and processed, to be accessed by individuals or to accrue to their benefit through this ubiquitous networking system. Korea has a variety of so-called U-cities in development. The largest and most famous project is called Songdo City, to try to facilitate the development of ubiquitous cities as a sort of sustainable future city, one which can use resources efficiently, one which can thus be part of a broader carbon or greenhouse gas mitigation strategy, has been to have a sort of one-stop regulation. That the Korean National Assembly has promulgated a single unified regulation which prescribes all of the relevant administrative protocols and rulemaking for ubiquitous city development. There's also been substantial public oversight and investment in these ubiquitous cities as well. While the cities are still being developed and there's still a lot of uncertainty about their future, on one level this may seem to be an efficient use of central power to try to offer one potentially compelling vision for how society can begin meaningfully shifting to patterns of life from the way people live, the way they interact with each other, the way they experience their communities, in a direction that is more sustainable and more responsive to environmental needs and environmental limitations. One legal problem that maybe springs to mind right away, and I think particularly for a Western audience, would be privacy. Some of the specific measures I described may pose very serious concerns when it comes to privacy. For instance, the amount of information that's being gathered and explicitly matched to individuals would seemingly put whoever gathers that information or aggregates has access to it, probably some kind of government agency or other publicly overseen institution, gives them incredibly vast knowledge and potentially could be very intrusive into the sense that into the idea of any person being able to sort of remove themselves or have a private solitude away from the public eye. Perhaps a more practical problem is, while ubiquitous cities may seem very interesting in theory, almost a kind of science fiction-like vision, would they actually be desirable environments for individuals to live? Would individuals choose, given the alternative, to have a U-city lifestyle versus something more like an existing and far from network ubiquitous environment? It may be the case that, as well laid as the plans for U-cities are, individuals may simply not find them to be attractive urban areas, and in the end it may be an expensive and not naturally sustainable system if individuals don't choose to embrace and, through their own decisions as members of the society, as consumers, to make this kind of alternative vision successful. So the jury is certainly out on ubiquitous cities, but I think an intriguing development in Korea. I should note, though, a very important specific policy in Korea that may illustrate the trajectory of green growth so far has been the so-called Four Rivers Project. The current Korean president, President Lee, had originally proposed the idea of constructing a canal which would have connected the two major cities of Seoul, two major cities of Korea, which are on opposite corners of the Korean peninsula, Seoul and Busan. After this received many objections, a subsequent proposal was to do a Four Rivers Project, to take the four largest rivers of Korea and to engage in a comprehensive construction project which would, in theory, improve the ecological condition of those rivers, would make them a more economically valuable asset, and as part of that economic value, make them more attractive, desirable for tourism, and increase property values. The idea of the river project was to do extensive dredging of the rivers, to do kind of major landscaping and modify the dimension and flow of the rivers, damming and management of water. The idea was that these steps could clean and improve the water quality, restore something like a natural or green ecosystem to the rivers, manage flooding, make water access more stable. However, there were many objections to the Four Rivers Project from its very inception and implementation. One objection was the cost. The Four Rivers Project, which is now basically complete, cost about 20 billion United States dollars, a very, very large expenditure for the Korean government to undertake. Arguments that, in fact, its ecological objective was either misguided or subterfuge, because this kind of human redefinition of the river environment, polluted as they already have been by human steps and human activity, would simply render a river which is no closer to being its original ecological environment in the first place. And perhaps then the final objection was this is, in general, a boondoggle. This is a huge public investment. It's very difficult to see what the benefits would be besides providing very large contracts to construction companies. However, the government maintained that this would be the signature first project of green growth, that it would create new economic value by making the rivers more attractive, by mitigating flooding costs, by making the water supply easier to manage, and thus optimizing value in that particular resource area. One troubling aspect is that this project seemed to proceed in the absence of public consensus, in fact, with a growing public consensus that the project was fundamentally misguided. It seems wrong to say that a democratic government can never act against the stated preferences of the majority of the populace at any moment in time. But for a project that would cause such a seemingly permanent and dramatic change to the very landscape of Korea and to some of its most conspicuous natural resources, seems that acting without something like a more favorable consensus would be allowing government policy to define in perpetuity a policy which doesn't align with popular preferences and wasn't necessarily the result of any kind of rigorous debate or democratic process. So far, it's been difficult to quantify the benefits of the Four Rivers Project, while the costs, at least some of them, are easy to quantify, the initial cost being the most conspicuous one. But some have objected to the whole green growth project and the whole green growth concept by saying the Four Rivers Project illustrates not what green growth aspirationally should be, but rather what it is proving to be. That it's driven by the government, government expenditure, centralized vision, rather than using incentive-based instruments, that its consistency with environmental or economic long-term objectives is dubious, and that ultimately it's a unilateral reflection of the policymakers' preferences rather than the result of a more open society-wide process. So, while I personally wouldn't say that we can judge green growth one way or the other based either on, say, ubiquitous cities or on the Four Rivers Project, firstly because both of those investments cannot be fully analyzed at this point, and secondly because each of them represent just a fraction of the broader picture of what green growth may be. Perhaps that gives us a little bit of color and a little bit of pause for thinking about what the consequences of Korea's green growth vision have been so far. And then just a couple words about cap and trade. Korea began drafting legislation about 3 years ago, which would have implemented a cap and trade system starting in the year 2013. There would have been a defined number of carbon emission credits for several hundred of the very largest emitters in Korea. I believe the biggest 300 carbon emitters in Korea emit about 60 or 65% of all of the carbon emissions nationwide. And so they would be capped, and there would be a trading system where they could buy or sell credits as needed in order to sort of match their actual emissions with the number of credits that they possess. And the broader objective would be to try to achieve that 30% reduction from business as usual Korea-wide by the year 2020, and to implement the cap-and-trade system in such a way as to make that happen. The bill and several alternative versions have been debated for several years. Currently, it's still in committee in the Korean legislature, still pending a final vote. And timing is very important on this issue because 2012 is not just a presidential election year in the United States, but also in South Korea. And so perhaps the picture when it comes to the Korean government and certainly the Korean presidency's view about the green growth issue and cap and trade could change dramatically as of next year. So as is often the case with that kind of political uncertainty, now may be the time for Korea to either act or not about implementing cap and trade. Already the current proposal would only be implemented in the year 2015, but nonetheless some of the same objections still apply. Should Korea be a first mover in this area? Should Korea move more aggressively than many other nations, for instance the United States, that have not undertaken any kind of equivalent commitment up until now? So just to wrap up, one way of viewing the current situation in Korea may be to say that there's a kind of forward and backward-looking tension, something like the classical god Janus, both looking forward and backward with two faces. Korea itself struggles with the idea, I think, of whether it should be regarded internally or externally as a developed or a developing nation. In my own experience, within Korea, one often hears that Korea is developed, but then at certain moments in time, the language shifts to Korea is, after all, a developing nation. Korea hasn't achieved the same level of per capita prosperity as the wealthiest nations, certainly as the United States or Western Europe or Japan. And so is Korea, on one hand, in a position to sort of bridge the developing and the developed world, that Korea, having improved its fortunes dramatically and gone from, for instance, a G77 nation now to a G20 nation, is Korea in a position to sort of look backwards and look forwards, look toward the condition of the developing nations and developed nations to try to offer a sensitive and inclusive vision of how countries on both sides of the economic development spectrum can potentially work together? Or rather, is Korea sort of frozen in place by the kind of indeterminacy of whether or not to undertake more obligations and more of a leadership role, or rather to assume a more passive position when it comes to international environmental law? Probably it's simply too early to say what Korea's position will be, and for that matter, whether it's good or bad. Many of you may be familiar with a story which I think originated in China, but one hears it in Korea as well, about an old man who had only one horse on his whole farm. And one day the horse ran away, and the man's neighbors said, "This is an extremely tragic development, we're so sorry, what bad fortune?" And the old man said, "We'll see." And then a few weeks later, the horse came back with a wild stallion with him, and the neighbors came and said, "This is great fortune, now you have two horses, how lucky." And the man said, "We'll see." Then sometime later, his only son was riding the wild stallion, fell off and broke his leg. The neighbors, of course, again came and said, "What horrible fortune." The man said, "We'll see." And then shortly thereafter, because of a military campaign, all of the able-bodied young men were being conscripted into the military, but the man's son couldn't go because his leg was injured. And in some versions of the story, then it's sort of the ending is clear. Everything worked out well in the end. But I prefer to see this one as well as a kind of "we'll see" conclusion. That perhaps when the neighbors came and said, "How lucky, your son doesn't have to go to war," perhaps the best response would have to be, again, "we'll see." So my reason for ending with this is just to think about the idea that Korea's current position is very uncertain, the implications are uncertain, but it's also very hard to know what to hope for when it comes to what are the best next steps for Korea and for the international community when it comes to the green growth vision. So thank you very much for your attention, and now I'll be happy to hear any of your questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. That was wonderful. Folks, we do have several minutes for questions, so please continue to send those in using the chat feature, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. To start us off, John, we have a question from Nan Pham, who I think wants clarification about the cap-and-trade bill that's going through Korea right now, and wonders if that is going to allow companies to buy carbon credits from other countries, or if it's going to put boundaries on sort of trading within Korea.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's been highly debated. The original versions of cap and trade were meant to be as integrated as possible. And I would say in general, Korea has taken a more sort of linking and integration-oriented view when it comes to cap and trade as compared to other nations, and been more aggressive about, for instance, seeking out bilateral or multilateral opportunities, Southeast Asian rainforest projects, potentially pollution mitigation projects, for instance, in China. So this is really a huge issue, and from my way of understanding, Korean industry's view is that while cap and trade itself might seem to them a second best solution to something a little less quantified and a little less absolute, that enabling Korean companies to go abroad for carbon mitigation projects would be in their interest, would be preferable. And a number of big carbon-emitting Korean companies have, in fact, been seeking out those options for the last several years, in part looking forward to a potential future cap-and-trade system in which they would be limited, would be having to go to the market for the purchase of carbon credits, but may be able to achieve a more economical carbon credit strategy by obtaining credits for international projects. And so far as I know, that's currently being debated, but isn't entirely clear from the legislation itself, and much would remain, as for instance was an issue with the Kyoto Protocol, as well, an issue about sort of future determinations about which projects would be permissible, how much credit could be given. And I think we know the big problems, for instance, say leakage. If a company goes to the Korean regulator and says, we've invested in rainforest preservation project in Indonesia, and it's going to generate this number of credits because this is the amount of carbon which would have been released into the atmosphere through deforestation, but for our investment. It may first be very hard to say just to what extent is any avoided deforestation caused by, to what extent is that Korean company's action the but-for cause. And is there some kind of leakage problem? For instance, if you protect rainforest in a particular area, will the deforestation simply migrate to another rainforest further down the road? So how can, in other words, a total net reduction in carbon emissions, say, in Indonesia as a whole, be verified? And so in as much as there would be a lot of verification problems when it comes to international carbon credits, the system itself, it would be, I think, open in theory to credits from international trans-border investments, but in practice it may be very difficult to implement.
Great. I think that makes a lot of sense. We had a sort of follow-up comment on that from Jay Lee, who notes that a lot of Korean companies are already investing in these international carbon-reducing projects, and so from sort of their perspective, there might be an advantage in opening up those boundaries despite the implementation and oversight challenges, because it can leverage that existing effort that they've already made. We have sort of another point that comes from, and forgive me if I mispronounce names, folks, but narrowly.
I'm sorry, Aaron, I can't. I'm not hearing anything now. I'm not sure if you were. Oh,
really? Can you
jump
hear
in?
Anything? John, I think we're getting sound on our end. Is it any better now? Can you hear me? Can other folks hear me? If we could get some feedback from the audience about whether or not we're getting audio, that'd be great. We have some on our end, but it looks like our presenter may have lost our audio. John, you said you could hear me fine, right? Testing.
Yeah.
Testing. So it maybe stopped. All right, John. We're going to keep going here. Let me make sure that our presenter hasn't fallen off.
So actually, I'm not hearing anything right now. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I'm not able to hear anything from the host.
Sorry, folks. We're apparently John's not getting
Then
audio.
would you want to provide the question via text, and I could answer via text?
Yep. We're gonna do that.
I could provide my answer verbally, but if you could furnish the question, text message. So the question is, to my knowledge, the term green growth initially came from a report from UNSCAP, UN agency in Bangkok. Is there any difference in terms of the concept from that of the Korean government, or is the concept of green growth identical across the board or world? Well, I think that's a great question. And I'm reminded, perhaps it was about a year ago, I think it was a World Bank-funded event in Seoul, if I remember right, that I was attending. It was green growth focused, and there were representatives from countries across Asia discussing what green growth means in their countries. Of course, Korea was represented. I believe there was someone from Thailand, Cambodia, China, and several other countries as well. And so I think one question which sprang to mind, and as a moderator of one of the panels, the question I posed for everyone was, exactly what does the phrase green growth mean in your country? And so I think one of the sort of delegates discussing about Korean policy said, well, you can simply read the various literature the Korean government provides about what green growth means here. But as the discussion progressed, I think we could all agree that that wasn't a fully satisfactory answer, that the meaning of green growth is always complicated. And I think we couldn't say it has the same meaning across the board. From its original understanding, Korea has been one of the countries that's perhaps elaborated most specifically and centrally on the meaning of green growth, because we have this fairly massive piece of legislation with legislative history, with various statutory interpretations, with a growing body of administrative rulemaking built up around it. So the kind of body of law that is green growth in Korea is very vast and elaborate compared to in a lot of other countries, where green growth might have a sort of policy meaning, but what it means from the standpoint of lawmaking and any kind of codified meaning is less definite. But I think in every country, how we try to go from the perhaps more agreed upon general definition of green growth as synergizing environmental welfare and economic development, the specific meaning becomes very divergent from society to society. And so even if we see Korean green growth as a budding success story, how to generalize that success to other systems or to an international approach could be very difficult.
Great. John, are we getting audio again for you? Can you hear anything?
Great. So maybe I'll just move on to the next question that I see from the host via text. Let's see. So it was briefly mentioned during the presentation, the will of the next elected president for green growth is very critical on the future steps of Korea. Let's see, what is your view on the future of the Global Green Growth Institute? What role should it take in global climate change government, etc.? So Global Green Growth Institute, an organization based in Seoul, founded through the green growth legislation, up until now funded, or at least initially funded in large part by Korea, but intended to be a generalized international asset and a sort of, shall we say, nonpartisan institute for seeking international solutions and opportunities to promote a more generalized vision of green growth. I know I just said that generalizing the vision of green growth across borders might be very difficult, but the Global Green Growth Institute is committed to that. So I mean, there's a lot of questions about the Global Green Growth Institute moving forward. Will it stay closely aligned in terms of funding and in terms of logistics with the Korean government or Korean parties, or can it fully migrate towards being supported by many countries broadly, whether by governments, by NGOs, and can it be, in that sense, more explicitly reflective of a sort of a fully global or international organization? I think that vision is certainly a very promising one and would do a lot for cementing the Global Green Growth Institute as an important organization and an important player in generating innovative ideas and helping to go from green growth theory to reality in countries around the world in the future. And in terms of the next presidential election, how that would affect the Global Green Growth Institute or Korean green growth generally, well, it's a really good question, and I think a very difficult one to answer right now. Politics are always very dynamic in Korea, arguably even more than in other countries, and potential next presidents of Korea, I think, haven't addressed this particular issue specifically. But a major question would be, in the face of still fairly stagnant median income and household purchasing power in Korea, these kinds of issues about the Korean middle class may be a huge challenge for the next president. How to promote a vision of Korea which is environmentally responsible, which can still draw upon Korea's core economic strengths, and which can translate short, medium, and long term into more prosperity for the median Korean, for something like hopefully a growing Korean middle class in the future.
Can you hear us now?
Okay, I'm still not hearing, but I hear that we're going to have to bring it to a close now, so I assume that the host will be doing that.
Yeah, so I think most people can hear me, and hopefully that is the case. Thank you all for joining us. I don't know why we're encountering these technical glitches here at the but thank you, John, for your excellent discussion this afternoon. Can we say that? Unfortunately, our time, so we're going to cut off the Q&A session. But thank you for everyone who submitted questions. Even for those that we didn't get to, we are going to pass these questions along to John in a transcript so that he'll be able to see what everyone has been asking today. And again, if you'd like to revisit the discussion, see the slides again, hear the audio, and sort of generally go through this event again, we're going to upload the presentation and the recording online at the WebEx Yale envirocenter.yale.edu or webex.com, and we'll send everyone who registered an access link to that recording, so you'll have that ready. I'd also like to make you aware of the next and final event of our series, which is going to be held in just a few weeks during the week of May 7th through 11th. We're at the moment finalizing the exact date of that webinar now with our speaker. This concluding webinar will focus on China, which I think will be a great country to focus on for the last event in our series. And it's going to feature Dr. Fuqiang Yang, who is the Senior Advisor on Climate Change at NRDC. Invitations will be sent out this week, and we do hope that you'll join us again. So on behalf of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy and our partners, the World Resources Institute and Environmental Defense Fund, thank you very much again to Mr. Leitner and to all of our attendees. We look forward to talking with you again at our next webinar.